Welcome, everyone. The Psychiatry and Behavioral Health and Learning Network, sponsored by Sierra Tucson, is happy to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm Dr. Maureen Schwehr, Director of Integrative Services at Sierra Tucson, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, the relationship between our digestion and mental health and addiction. First, we're going to start with some of the housekeeping. If you have questions and answers, you can submit a question on the bottom left part of your screen at any point during the presentation. All questions will be answered during the last 10 minutes of this. Resources, you can find a PDF of the presentation and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. If you need any help or assistance, please feel free to email at this email, kciski@hmpglobal.com. In order to receive your credits, your NAADAC credits, you must watch the program in its entirety, including through the question and answer section. Do not leave the console. Please continue to stay on the platform, and you will be automatically redirected to an evaluation landing page. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2022, you need to create an HMP education account when you first are directed to the landing page. For all subsequent webinars you can attend, you'll already have an account and you just need to log in. After completing the evaluation, you'll be able to download your print your certificate. NAADAC credit is only offered for the live broadcast. As I said before, I'm Dr. Maureen Schwehr, and I'm the Director of Integrative Services here at Sierra Tucson. Sierra Tucson is a residential treatment facility where we work with people on mood issues, addiction, trauma, and pain. And I feel really grateful to be part of this integrative setting. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of information on what naturopathic medicine is, because I'm a naturopathic doctor. And I love what I do, but there's so much misinformation. This is just a quick slide going over the requirements to become a naturopathic doctor. And the point of this is just to point out that naturopathic physicians are well trained. It's a four-year graduate program, and as you can see here, a lot of the training is the same in the anatomy and biochemistry. When it comes to treatments, as a naturopathic physician, I learned about medications, but in addition to this, I spent a lot of time learning about nutrition and herbs and supplements. And so I have this broader tool chest when it comes to treatment options. This is a map of the United States, and it just shows where licensing is for naturopathic physicians. Naturopathic doctors are all licensed at the state level. Actually, all medical professionals are licensed at a state level. And currently, there are 22 states and territories that license naturopathic doctors. We're more commonly licensed on the coasts. So I am currently in Arizona. In Arizona, I'm a fully licensed medical provider. I can prescribe most medications. In Washington State, where I was trained, naturopathic doctors are considered primary care doctors. And we're actually able to, we are part of every insurance plan there. So whether or not your state is licensed, there are naturopathic doctors across the country. And some of those practicing in unlicensed states act as healthcare advisors, but they can't act as doctors in those states. So I think that I decided to start today with a case study because it gives you a good idea of how I think about things and how this all ties together. So this case study was actually one of the first people I ever treated. I was a brand new doctor. I moved to Arizona. I was doing a lecture on hormones. And afterwards, this woman came out to me and said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I have this assistant and she's so depressed. She's so depressed. I just feel like, I feel like you can help her." And so she was actually a judge. She was very sweet. She paid out of her pocket for her assistant to come see me because her assistant was so depressed that she was no longer going to work. She wasn't getting out of bed, and this had been so different from how she was before. So this woman came to me. She was 46 years old, and she was having an episode of fairly deep depression at this point. When I went through her history, she had a childhood history of some trauma. And as an adult, she'd done pretty well. She had married someone who was very supportive. They had a healthy relationship. She had a family. She had a job she really liked, and she was doing well. There was a couple of times where she'd had a little bit of depression in her life, but it was episodic and it was appropriate because there were some big things going on. So at age 46, she had managed to gain a little weight, as so many of us do, and she decided to lose weight. And at the time, the big thing that was super popular was the no-carb diets, and now we call them keto diets. So she went on this diet, started to lose weight. She loved that, but she started to just feel off, kind of, low energy. Her mood was down a bit. And during that time, she went for her annual gyne exam, told her doctor she wasn't feeling all that great, also told her her menstrual cycles were off. So the doctor put her on oral birth control pills to normalize her menstrual cycles. And what happened then is her depression worsened. She just crashed. At that point, she went back to her primary care doctor, told her, I am feeling very sick, like very depressed, was put on an antidepressant. I believe it was an SSRI. And then she just felt foggy and depressed. So from a naturopathic perspective, this is how I thought about this. When someone comes to me, I always ask them what was going on at the time. So when she came to me and told me she was depressed, I asked, when did you start being depressed? What was going on? What is changing? Had you been sick? Did you change your diet? So I think what was happening here is that when she went on a no-carb diet, carbohydrates are where we get our B vitamins, and B vitamins are very important nutrients. So without those B vitamins on board, she started to feel off. But honestly, she probably would have been okay until she eventually gave up on her diet. But when she went to her gynecologist and was given that birth control, most birth control pills are estrogen dominant. And as women age, our hormones start to shift, and progesterone and estrogen drops, but progesterone drops faster. So when she went on that, I think it was the big shift from being already low in progesterone to being relatively very low in progesterone that really pushed her over the edge into depression. And then I think when she went on an SSRI, it didn't help because she didn't actually have the nutrient she needed, the B vitamins, to make neurotransmitters. So without that, it wasn't going to actually help her serotonin levels much. So what I did when I worked with her, I took her off the birth control pills because she didn't care if her cycles were regular. I put her on a really good B complex. I talked to her about diet, told her that she could avoid simple carbohydrates like processed breads and pasta and white rice, but that she should eat complex carbs like brown rice and quinoa. We tested her hormones. She was low in progesterone, and I put her on bioidentical progesterone. And really within a week, she was fine. She was back to her old self. And I was super glad that all the stuff I learned in school actually worked. But I think that's a good example of how you have to kind of look at what are the causes. And it's also a good example of how digestion and our nutrients like B vitamins can have a big impact on our mood. So today we're going to talk about 3 areas: nutrient absorption, the enteric nervous system, and my favorite, intestinal microbiome. So we're going to do absorption first. This is just a very simplified version of our digestive system from the esophagus all the way down to the end of the large intestine. And as you can see, all of these are the nutrients and the vitamins that we absorb. So if anything is going on in any of these places to not have, that will affect absorption, then it's going to have a major impact on health. We live in this world where I think as Americans, we just want to think that what we eat doesn't matter that much. And I am amazed at what people can get away with, honestly. But in truth, every cell in our body is made up of basic building blocks, and almost all of them come in through our digestive system. So this is the methylation pathway. This I love. As a naturopathic doctor, I have to say I love biochemistry. So this is a diagram to represent how we make some really important molecules in our body. And the methylation pathway makes serotonin, which you all know we need for mood, which creates melatonin, which we need for sleep. This is important for dopamine production. It is also an important pathway to make glutathione, the master antioxidant. So when this pathway is interrupted, people mentally don't feel well, their serotonin's off, they don't sleep well, and they can have a lot of inflammatory problems. So I put this up here because you can see all these little colored circles. These are all vitamins. So a vitamin is a molecule that our body needs that we don't create ourselves. So it has to come in through our digestive system. And if any one of these are missing, the whole thing closes down and doesn't work. And so it's just a reminder of how complex all this is and how nutrients are important for some really important molecules. So the gut-brain connection, our brains and our digestive system are really closely linked. And part of this is because digestion is a really energy intense process in our body. It takes us a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of blood flow to have our digestion happen. And so humans are really primarily wired to be able to get to safety. So I think all of us are aware, like in the vernacular, how closely our digestion and our mood is linked. Like sadly, all of us have probably had experiences where someone told us something so horrible that it literally felt like we were being kicked in the gut. So these words, gut-wrenching experience, butterflies in the stomach, I can't stomach this. These are all part of what we say all the time because we recognize the importance of this link. So as we are developing as fetuses, we have one set of tissue, and that one set of tissue, as we continue to grow, it divides, and half of it becomes the brain and our spine and our nervous system, and the other half becomes our digestive system. So as we are developing, as our bodies are being created, our brain and our nervous system and our digestion used to be one. And as they separate, there is a whole extra nervous system called the enteric nervous system that actually continues to connect the two. So this system is there so that if we're in an emergency, we can turn off digestion so we can run away to safety, right? And it also means that if we are in a chronic state of not feeling safe, if we live in a pandemic, if we have an addiction, if we are worried about stuff all the time, that our digestion is really impacted. And I have definitely worked with many, many people where I was suspicious that their digestive system had been impacted by stress from childhood, maybe from before birth. This is that chart so popular out there of the autonomic nervous system. And this is just a reminder, our autonomic nervous system is always either in a state of parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, or sympathetic, which is fight or flight. And so whenever we are in that sympathetic state, it affects so many things. It changes our heart rate, our breathing rate. It changes how glucose is stored in our body. It changes our digestion. And those are big impacts that can mess with us in so many ways. So when I was doing the research to be able to do this webinar, I went in and I was looking for, different studies. And one of the things that I found was a lot of research around irritable bowel syndrome. So irritable bowel syndrome is, I think a lot of us are aware of this. It's when someone has kind of chronic digestive issues. It can be nausea, dyspepsia, meaning your stomach feels off, bloating, abdominal pain, loose stools, or constipation. And sometimes people go back and forth. IBS is very linked to stress. So there's been a lot of studies around this. And what they found is that, for instance, once someone develops irritable bowel syndrome, they have a subsequent increased risk for depression, anxiety, insomnia, and bipolar disorder. The risk is pretty high that first year, but even 5 years out, you are still more likely to develop one of these mental health issues. They also found that people with bipolar disorder who were still had a high anxiety depression scale, so these are people who their bipolar disorder is not well controlled, they found that almost a third of them also reported IBS. So in the literature, a lot of it sort of says, so these are together, just be aware of it. But as a naturopathic doctor, I am suspicious that there could be a direct link with that. Once the digestion's offline and we're no longer able to properly digest our food, absorb our nutrients, that this can really mess with our ability to make the neurotransmitters we need to feel well. So now we're on to my favorite topic, which is gut bacteria. We all have between 4 and 6 pounds of bacteria in our gut. And that's the way it's supposed to be. We as animals, as human beings, have developed in a world that is filled with bacteria and microbes and viruses and all these other things. And we're actually meant to live in that world. So they have actually determined that there are more actual cells of bacteria on and in our body than we have our own cells. So these are important beings that are just part of us. And one of the things that's changed in the last 15 years or so is that with DNA technology, we are now able to quickly and easily assess people's microbiomes. We're able to really figure out exactly what kind of bacteria are inside of a digestive system. It used to be we had to do a stool sample to a petri dish, and it was very inexact. And you couldn't get the small amounts of things. Now we can send off a sample and we can tell exactly what's going on. And this has led to some really interesting and exciting research on this topic. So those 4 to 6 pounds of bacteria in our gut are very important. And I'm just going to go through some of the ways that they're important first. So the first is really immune system development. Before we are born, our digestive system is sterile. And what happens is through the birthing process, we are exposed to the bacteria, and that goes into our digestive system, and it helps to start teach our digestive system how our immune system should work. So inside of our digestive system are these little areas called Peyer's patches, and they actually sample what's going on to help teach our immune system what to do. For our immune system, it's important that we be able to fight off bacteria and viruses when they're harmful. And it is really important also that we don't attack everything. If we think that every time you eat a little bit of wheat or a piece of chicken, that's an enemy and we attack it, then we end up living in a war zone and our body does not do well. So it's important, it's actually called tolerance. Our digestive system, it's important for our immune system to know what to tolerate, to not attack our own cells, to not attack food, but to attack the bacteria and viruses and fungus that might be making us sick. And it turns out that our gut bacteria are really important in that process. So our beneficial bacteria also crowd out pathogens. So if someone is in a car accident and they go into the hospital, they'll often be given broad spectrum IV antibiotics. Broad spectrum means that those antibiotics kill off almost every kind of bacteria. When that happens, they kill off the good guys too. And then what can happen is that people can get sick from things like C. diff. C. diff is called C. difficile because it's difficile to kill. And so it's very common for people to get an overgrowth of this, which makes people very sick. Candida is a common yeast. Everyone has Candida in our bodies. It can cause thrush if it overgrows in the esophagus, mouth, and it can cause vaginal yeast infections in women. So it's always there. But if you end up on a lot of antibiotics, if you eat a lot of sugar, the Candida can overgrow. And then what happens is with too much of that yeast, it can end up causing inflammation in the body. So the beneficial bacteria help to really block that out. So nutrient production, it turns out that some important vitamins, some B vitamins and vitamin K are actually created by bacteria in our gut. And short chain fatty acids, we're going to talk about this a little later, they are molecules created by bacteria breaking down fiber, and they're very anti-inflammatory. In addition, our gut bacteria actually make some neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about that in a second. And it turns out that they are responsible for creating molecules and signals that can either increase inflammation in the body or decrease it. So the neurotransmitter production, I think, is so interesting. Serotonin, so important. Without enough serotonin, we feel like we're in a pit without any joy. So serotonin production is actually a two-step process. When we eat protein of some sort, for instance, turkey has a lot of tryptophan. The tryptophan is broken down by gut bacteria into 5-hydroxytryptophan. Then that molecule, the 5-HTP, is actually absorbed into the body where we create serotonin. So without the proper bacteria, we don't do that well. GABA is the most calming of our neurotransmitters. And as of the last time for this slide, it was created, we'd found 7 different types of bacteria that actually create GABA or its precursors. So GABA is well absorbed because bacteria actually make it in our gut. That's why as a naturopath, sometimes I'll actually give people GABA orally because it's well absorbed and they'll just bring it into the body and it can help calm them. This is just an awesome slide to consider memorizing. It just lists out the different kinds of bacteria to show how they make different molecules, including histamine, which is not always good if someone is having a lot of histamine reactions. But more and more, we're beginning to understand how these bacteria are actually helping us to create molecules that are impacting mood. So the earliest studies on this actually worked with mice and trying to look at like how they might be impacting mood. And the first study was actually they just took mice that had been bred to be very anxious. They have a whole breed of mice where they take the most anxious mice and breed them to the most anxious mice until they have mice who don't run mazes. They hide in corners and don't play with each other. And they took some of them, gave some of them a broth with lactobacillus in it, beneficial bacteria, and some not. And those with the lactobacillus actually started to act less anxious. So this was a follow-up study. They took mice that were germ-free. So they literally did a C-section on a mouse, which seems incredible how tiny they are. So they took those tiny little baby mice and they kept them in a germ-free environment. And then they measured what was going on. And what they found is like in their bloodstream, they would have more cortisol. They had more stress hormones. And then what they did is they gave them a probiotic, Bifidobacterium infantis, which is a really common bacteria for infants. And what they found is that once they did that, they started to have less anxiety, and it also lowered the stress hormones in their blood. They also found, let me see, so germ-free or antibiotic-treated rodents. So in other studies, what they did is they took rodents that had bacteria in their gut, but they gave them strong antibiotics. And they found that it reduced the microbial diversity. So they had less different kinds of bacteria in their gut. And they found that they showed cognitive deficit. So those mice actually had reduced memory, reduced working memory, and changes in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of the brain that is really important in memory and retaining information. And so those studies linked cognitive changes to the gut biome. So this is just a list of some of the different diseases that I found where there have been studies to show how the gut microbiome affects the severity of the diseases. There's actually way more than this. So inflammation, to kind of just go back on that again, I think I talked about this a bit. So some of the bacteria in our gut are very important because once we give them fiber, things from fruits and vegetables and whole grains, they break that down and they create these really important short chain fatty acids, acetate, butyrate, propionate. And these are really important to decrease inflammation in the gut, but also in the body. They also found that when you have dysbiosis, and we're going to talk about like what that definition is. Dysbiosis, basically the less than optimal kinds of bacteria, either in numbers or in different species, that it can lead to increased inflammatory cytokines. So in response, the body actually makes more signaling molecules that cause more inflammation. So here, what is dysbiosis? So if you go through the literature, there's a lot of talk about alpha diversity and beta diversity. And so it's been, when you look at diversity in our microbiome, one of the things that they've done is they've gone back to, and it's harder and harder now, but they find people who've not been exposed to the Western diet. And then what they do is they look, they take samples and look at the makeup of their biome, what kind of bacteria are in their gut. And then they are comparing this. So alpha diversity is the diversity within one person. So in my gut, if we take a sample, how many different kinds of bacteria are they and how are they sampled? Is it like I have 12 different kinds, but almost all of them are one kind, or are they all sort of spread out? So they look at that diversity. Beta diversity is comparing that to another population. So one of the things that they found out in the anti-aging world is that with a standard American diet, they can actually really accurately tell you how old someone is from a sample of your gut microbiome. So if they take a sample, they can tell you how old that you are, and it's very accurate. So as we get older, our gut bacteria really shift. And one of the things they did is they took some of the bacteria from an older, unhealthy people, and they now are doing fecal implants into mice models and rodent models. And what they found is that when they take an older person's gut bacteria and implant it in a young mouse, they actually find changes, aging changes in the mouse. So what we're seeing is that the gut microbiome is connected. They also did like that beta diversity. They went to some of the places in the world where people regularly live really long and healthy lives, and their gut microbiome is much younger looking. The changes in those populations between a young person and a very old person, meaning in their 90s or above, is much less than the changes you see in the standard American diet. So talking a little bit about like whether or not gut bacteria might be protective against inflammation, we know they make those short chain fatty acids. So this was a really interesting study. In order to study the inflammation associated with Alzheimer's disease, what they do is they take D-galactose and they inject it into mice. And then they're able to look at the changes in the brain structure. And the inflammatory response looks very similar to that takes place in Alzheimer's. So in this study, they took a bunch of mice, they injected them with D-galactose, and then in half of them, they gave them a probiotic, a broth that had beneficial bacteria. And what they found is that with the addition of those beneficial bacteria, there was much less inflammation in the brain. So this was followed up with other studies with humans, and there is some good evidence that regularly doing fermented foods, yogurt, kimchi, kombucha, things like that, which expose us to those natural probiotics, actually seem to be protective against Alzheimer's. So gut microbiome and drug metabolism. So what this is about, so it turns out, as a doctor, it's really clear to me that if I prescribe a drug to someone, it just doesn't work the same way in every single person. And in the mental health field, the diversity of response seems to be bigger than any other area. in general, when you have to do a lot of work to find the right medications to help mental health conditions. So what this study is showing, actually there were several studies here, is that the makeup of our gut bacteria actually changes the way we metabolize drugs. So when we take a drug, when you swallow it, your body breaks it down into certain metabolites. Those metabolites are often the pieces that are responsible for the side effects of those drugs. And so it turns out that how we process a drug, the metabolites we break it down to, how fast or slow it is metabolized, is very impacted by our microbiome. There are listed here some really common drugs that have been shown to be affected by this, including like simvastatin, which is used for cholesterol, L-DOPA. But the thing is that most drugs haven't been tested, but I suspect that actually the bacteria affects so many of them. So I recently updated this to include this webinar to include more information about alcohol dependency and dysbiosis. There's been a lot more studying around this. And so this was from a 2014 study. And what they were looking at is how could the gut bacteria be impacting alcohol dependency? They found that with chronic alcohol intake, there is damage to the gut barrier, especially in the small intestine. And that affects the permeability of the gut, which is what we call leaky gut. They found that the amount of damage to that barrier, the amount of leaky gut, is associated with the severity of the behaviors in alcohol dependence. And they found that also the more there was the more damage there was to the intestine, there was increased depression, anxiety, and reported cravings. And so with here, they're starting to understand, okay, with chronic alcohol use, one of the things that happens is it damages the intestinal barrier inside our gut. And that starts to have big impacts on the behaviors and the other mental health conditions associated. So going through, this was from a retrospective, they found that chronic alcohol use, we just talked about it, it impairs the intestinal barrier. It also is associated with changes in the composition of the gut microbiome. It changes the kinds of bacteria that are present as well. They find that it depletes vital nutrients, especially thiamine, which I think we're aware of, but other B vitamins like folate, B12 are also depleted. I think there's a secondary piece here. Often you have that feed-forward loop. Someone has an addiction problem, and then almost always the quality of the food that they begin to take into their body really drops with that, which has a secondary way of really impacting their nutritional status. Chronic alcohol use increases inflammatory markers, and that is also included inflammatory markers in the brain as well as in the body. They found that neuroinflammation, that increased inflammation, it actually leads to a demyelination in the brain. So it starts to change the nerve fibers in the brain. And that is part of what's going on in changing this sort of balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And this is linked to the whole addictive process. In this study, I thought this was really interesting. So what they did is they brought in a group of people who were in treatment for alcohol addiction. And one of the things they did is they tested their gut microbiome. And so they tested for signs of leaky gut. There are markers in the stool that tells you that there is more inflammation in the gut. So across those samples, they did that to look at what all the different people, like what was the state of the health of their gut. And then they also did a series of personality tests with them. What they found is that specifically the personality changes associated with sociability and increased social anxiety were the ones that were most influenced. So the people with the most dysbiosis and the most leaky gut had the highest scores in social anxiety and problems with socializing. So then they took those individuals and they took some of the stool and they implanted it into healthy mice. So they wanted to say, so what they saw is, okay, we have a correlation between unhealthy gut and increased social anxiety. And then they took some of the gut bacteria and put it into a healthy mouse to see, is this part of what's causing this? And what they found is that once they did that, the bacterial makeup of the mouse would change. So we're saying, okay, yes, it now has the same kind of changes in the microbiome. And the mice started to exhibit more problems with sociability. They avoided other mice. They just had more anxiety around social situations. So they were able to actually link that gut microbiome seems to be perhaps a causative piece here. So this is a study on cognition. When I work with individuals, memory and working memory is such a big part for them. I think this really, it also in recovery, it messes with people because they feel like they're not on their game. They don't feel capable to be able to work. It just messes with so many things in someone's life when you can't remember things properly. So in this study, they had almost 600 participants. The mean age was 55. What they did is they measured the makeup of their gut bacteria. And what they found is that the beta diversity, the amounts of different bacteria compared to a healthy, was highly associative with cognitive, meaning the less diversity there was, the more the microbiome was sort of was non-complex and it didn't have a rich diversity of bacteria. The more that was going on, the more cognitive problems someone had. And then they were able to actually link some of these specific kinds of bacteria with problems. So they found that some of the bacteria were really associated with positive cognition, that if it was present, people did better, and some was really with negative. So this is part of that process of trying to figure out, okay, we know that if it's less diverse, that's a problem, but now we're trying to really break it down and see if certain bacteria are more important in that diversity. And that'll help us be able to eventually develop better treatments. So I thought this was really an interesting study about long COVID. And this study was actually done, these participants had not been vaccinated because this was before vaccines were available, and this was done in Taiwan. So what they did, I thought it was great that they thought of this. So they took 106 people who were being hospitalized for COVID, and they actually took a stool sample from all of them. And then what they did is they looked at the stool samples comparing to the people who recovered and those that ended up with long COVID. So after 3 months, so of course, these are very sick people if they're being hospitalized. So this was serious. This was a serious kind of COVID for them. At 3 months, 86 of them had post-acute COVID syndrome. They still had symptoms from COVID. And at 6 months, 81 of them still had some of these symptoms. The symptoms could include fatigue, poor memory, hair loss, anxiety, trouble sleeping, and in some cases, ongoing respiratory problems. So because they'd taken these stool samples at the beginning, they were able to look and see if there was a correlation. And what they found is that the people who had more dysbiosis, the people who had a less healthy kind of gut bacteria, when they were hospitalized, were more likely to develop post-COVID syndrome. So they also found that those that had an abnormal amount of so those that had dysbiosis when they were originally hospitalized, some of them did not get post-COVID. And what they found, though, is when they tested their stool sample, their bacteria had actually normalized. So those people with dysbiosis, where it got better, they also did not develop long COVID. So the people with dysbiosis who continue to have dysbiosis also were more likely to continue to have long COVID symptoms. So this makes sense to me as a naturopathic doctor because I think about the inflammatory molecules. I think about how a healthy gut biome is going to help you make important nutrients that you need to fight off an infection, how important they are for us to be able to heal. They also were able to actually link different problems with different kinds of bacteria. So those who still had respiratory symptoms, they had a higher level of opportunistic pathogens. Those with the neuropsychiatric symptoms like fatigue, it was actually associated with nosocomial infections, which are hospital-acquired bacteria. So it's really common when someone is hospitalized for them to pick up a lot of the kind of bacteria that hang out in hospitals, like Clostridium. So they found that if they had more of those nosocomial bacteria, they were more likely to still have these kind of neuropsychiatric symptoms. Hair loss was associated with not having enough of the bacteria that produce butyrate, one of those short-chain fatty acids, which is an inflammatory marker. So I think that's giving us a lot of important clues here. This kind of leads to that sort of piece on like, what do we do? Like, what do we do about all this? In general, as a naturopathic doctor, I always think about digestion whenever I'm treating anything. Digestion is always a piece of the intake. I talk to people, and in general, a healthy gut microbiome needs the same sort of things that healthy people need. They need a calm environment. So stress has a big impact on our digestion and our gut microbiome. They need the right kind of foods to feed them, right? So healthy foods, whole foods, foods that were the kind of foods we were developed to eat, like meaning it's been a very short period of time in the whole human existence that we've had the kind of processed foods that we now have. People have traditionally eaten whole foods, which are foods that look like how they come from the earth. So fermented foods are really important. I think if we go back to our grandmothers or even their grandmothers, we're going to find the fermented foods. All of the traditions across the globe include fermented foods. My grandmother was German, and we literally used to make sauerkraut in the hallway in our tiny little house when I was a kid. I remember we did that every single year because that was just part of what you did. Yogurt, kimchi, all of those. Kombucha is really popular. Of course, any of you know, if you're in the addiction world, kombucha can create some alcohol, so I never recommend it for anyone who's had any addiction problems. But there are plenty of other good foods out there to be able to do that. And I think we should get back to the tradition of including fermented foods in our diets all the time, because that's how humans have actually eaten for a long time. So this I got from one of the studies. I cited it here because I certainly was not capable of creating this beautiful image. So this does a good job of showing how poor quality diets and healthy diets affect digestion. And you can see poor quality diets, a lot of animal protein, saturated fats, refined grains, sugar, salt, alcohol, corn-derived fructose. You can see how this messes with us. It reduces microbial diversity. It increases infection by pathogens. It causes inflammation in the gut. There's an erosion of the mucosal layer, which leads to leaky gut and intestinal permeability. And it also means a much lower amount of these really important short-chain fatty acids that we need to reduce inflammation. And remember that inflammation is associated with joint pain and discomfort, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, like all of the chronic diseases have at their base inflammation as part of what's going on. So healthy diet is the way we're just meant to eat: fruits, vegetables, fibers, plant-derived proteins. The MUFAs and the PUFAs, those are the fatty acids. So unsaturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those are the more healthy oils. Olive oil, avocados, coconut oil, those are healthier choices for us. And as you can see, that helps to keep our digestion, it helps to keep our bacteria diverse and healthy. It helps to keep the intestinal lining in place. It helps to create a lot of anti-inflammatory molecules. Go back. This was an interesting meta-analysis. So what they did here is they looked at all the different studies that had been done so far on anxiety and depression, and looked at like what were the correlations. And what they found was prebiotics. So prebiotics are things that feed our good bacteria, like Saccharomyces boulardii, inulin. You'll have these prebiotic things. In these studies, they didn't find a big correlation between them and decreased anxiety and depression. They found that probiotics, which are the beneficial bacteria given directly, were associated with a small but significant decrease in depression and anxiety in many trials. Like across the different trials, they were able to find that. They found that studies with lactobacillus alone did not show significant decrease in anxiety or depression. So I think that the data is pretty good to really show that you should always be assessing digestion when you're looking at anxiety, depression, all of these things. I think that some of the reason there was so much variability in this is when I look at these studies are often a single kind of bacteria kind of put in. Researchers love to limit the number of factors involved. And so as a naturopathic doctor, I just hate that, because the truth is when someone is really sick, when someone has anxiety or depression or, alcohol, is trying to, heal their liver because of chronic alcohol intake, making one change alone is usually not enough to really get a significant difference. And so putting one bacteria in doesn't make sense, because study after study shows that you need broad spectrum. So I think as we get better at studying this, we're going to be able to better understand how putting in, really treating the person individually and treating the digestive system overall, not just with one lactobacillus, but with a broad spectrum probiotic, maybe plus some prebiotics, plus some healing things to soothe that gut lining, are going to be more effective overall. So I just had to throw this in because I just am not a big fan of these non-caloric artificial sweeteners. These are the, all the, I probably shouldn't say all the different specific brands, but these are all the things that they use to have the no-calorie drinks that are out there. So this was a small study, but it was super interesting. So they took a group of healthy people with no blood glucose problems. So all of them had really healthy glucose control, right? And then for 5 days, they had them drinks with saccharin at the highest FDA-approved amount. So they said, okay, you're going to drink the amount the FDA says is okay at the highest amount for 5 days. I know that there are people out there drinking maybe 20 times that when I talk to some individuals. So after 5 days, what they found is there was a correlation with doing that and having a lot of metabolic syndromes. After only 5 days, they had increased fat around their center. They had a higher fasting blood glucose level. They had an increase in their hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of inflammation because of poor glucose regulation. And they had higher measures of glucose intolerance. So they were already slowly walking towards type 2 diabetes. 4 of the 7 developed significant glucose dysregulation. 3 of them did not. So of the 7 people, it was a small study, but still 4 of them started to develop all of these symptoms after only 5 days. So then what they did is they took the stool from those that had the glucose dysregulation and they put them into germ-free mice and the mice develop the same glucose intolerance. So there's something about the makeup of that gut microbiome that is transferring that intolerance to the mice. So the change in the microbiome showed a 20-fold increase in some types of bacteria, Bacteroides, Weissella, and a 10-fold decrease in Clostridiales. So what they're showing is there's certain bacteria that seem to be really impacted by these fake sugars. And it seems like that's a really important piece in our glucose regulation. And I know whenever I'm working with someone who has type 2 diabetes, I always tell them that all of the artificial sweeteners need to go, because all of them seems to continue to cause glucose dysregulation. It's not the sugar, it's more complex than that. Negative feedback loops. This is just what I see happening all the time with us. Something stressful happens, and then we often stop eating healthy food. We eat more processed food, more simple carbohydrates. Often our immune system's off because of the stress. Then we get sick. Then maybe we're put on antibiotics or proton pump inhibitors or pain medications, which mess with our digestion. The antibiotics kill off the good bacteria. Proton pump inhibitors lower the acidity in the gut, which messes with things. Pain medications like opioids really slow down the motility of the gut. All these things cause more problems. Then we get changes in the microbiome that makes people feel worse, and then this all kind of continues. I'm just going to leave this slide up as we go to questions. One of the things that happens is people always ask me questions that are related to what are good probiotics and those sorts of things. And so I put that in because I know the questions are always there. So Claire Labs and Genestra are both companies that have some really high quality probiotics that I trust and that I've seen good efficacy with. Consumer Labs is an organization you can join, and they will give you some ratings for supplement quality. Supplements are not regulated. I'm not sure I want them regulated. It just gets complex. But the truth is that no one's really testing to see if the stuff on the shelf that you buy at Walmart or Walgreens is what it says it is. So Consumer Labs gives you some of that information. It's not perfect because I do think Consumer Labs favors those that advertise with them or pay them, but it does give you some good information. All right, I'm going to go to questions. All right, this is a good one. A lot of the research you talked about focused on showing correlations, but what about treatments? And I agree, yes. I have already noticed in the last couple of years, as I go through the research on this topic, it's gone from, oh, I can't believe that somehow gut microbiome might affect anxiety, to now the studies are in that sort of category of oh, we believe that. Now, is it really the bacteria? And we've been proving that. And actually, it's been interesting to see how well they've been able to prove that by transferring the bacteria to a mice and having the same results is really good evidence that those bacteria are important. Then when I get to the study part of why my lecture or this webinar has sort of vagaries is because the literature is sort of vagaries too. A lot of these studies, they just don't have the complexity that I would really love to see in them, meaning the researchers have not yet been using broad spectrum probiotics, putting in a big mix of probiotics and also having them be long enough. A lot of these studies are so short. When they start looking at treatments, they're not very quality because they're so short that it wouldn't be long enough to really see the changes. And so I think that'll be the next piece going forward. I know as a naturopathic doctor, I have colleagues that really work in research to encourage researchers to look at things more holistically. So, from a naturopathic perspective, if someone comes into me and I talk about digestion, I'm not just giving everybody a probiotic. That's not the answer. It's about going back and trying to figure out where the problem comes from, and then trying to treat that comprehensively. So for instance, if someone comes in and they have digestion problems, first of all, if they're constipated, I need to stop that. I need this to flow. I think of a healthy, like, digestive system as a stream. And so that stream should be flowing nicely, and it should have the right kind of bacteria, and it should have like healthy sides to it. It should be a healthy stream bed. And so I think about the flow of it, and that might mean treating stress first. It might mean taking them off a proton pump inhibitor if it's appropriate. It's about treating the cause. And then what I want to do is I would think about repopulating, but just putting in good bacteria. Sometimes that's appropriate. If someone has a lot of symptoms, I'll often first try to kill off their bad bacteria. And sort of clean things out, and then I'll put the good bacteria back in. And then I often also, there's a lot of really wonderful supplements to be able to help heal that leaky gut. So I think about treating the whole person, but at the same time, I'm treating everything else. So I think we're starting to get to the research to give us better information. I guess, okay, I'm a realist. So the takeaway I would say for now is, if you're going to do probiotics, it's better to do broad spectrum, ones that have a wide variety of them. And I think fermented foods, getting those bacteria from foods is better than getting it from a pill. Okay, next question. How do you know if your gut is out of whack? That's great. So, yeah, being able to assess this is an important piece. So I think especially if we're under a lot of stress, a lot of us are good at ignoring our bodies and putting up with an awful lot. I have talked to people where they'll say, oh yeah, I've had like chronic diarrhea. How long? Oh, 20 years. Like, I would never put up with that for 20 years, but to them, that's normal. So when I talk to someone about digestion, it's about tapping into that. So when you eat something, do you feel nauseous or upset? Does it feel like things are flowing okay? Like, what are your symptoms? Do you have any bloating or abdominal discomfort? Do you have normal stools that are easy to pass? So if we really look at those symptoms, tell us a lot about what's going on. Now, sometimes we can have a really poor quality of gut bacteria even without symptoms. So with that, I often just talk to people about their diet, like what's going on, what are you eating? So if someone has been eating a very standard American diet, then their gut bacteria are not going to be that great. Now, if they're doing fine, if they say, my son is 22, he has friends who literally live off of French fries, hamburgers, and candy. And I have no idea how they do so well. And so, then it's about symptoms, right? So if you have a very poor quality diet and you feel great, that's fine. But if you don't feel great, right? If there's insomnia, anxiety, depression, inflammation, then I start to question that. So there are companies out there that you can actually do comprehensive stool analysis. There are ones that will do a DNA analysis for you. There are ones that'll give you the markers to see if you have inflammation. I'll often do a blood test looking for highly sensitive CRP, which is C-reactive protein. It's a marker of low-level inflammation. And if that's high, I always suspect that digestion might be a piece. And that's where I look at putting in good bacteria, changing the diet to have a more high-fiber diet to be able to create more of those anti-inflammatory molecules. So one more question. I've heard a lot about this thing called SIBO. What is that? So SIBO is very commonly talked about now around digestion. It's small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And I think small intestine bacterial overgrowth is something that most of us have some form of. If you think about what the ideal gut bacteria should be, most of your bacteria should be in your large intestine. When you have an overgrowth of the wrong kind of bacteria, especially in the small intestine, it's more likely to cause inflammation. So SIBO is very closely linked to irritable bowel syndrome. I think most cases of IBS are actually caused by SIBO. And so it's a whole nother topic I'd actually love to talk about sometime. I think kind of the breakaway with that is it's about treating the whole person. And in SIBO, often that stream, that healthy stream, is too slow because of stress or other things, and it has the wrong bacteria in it. And so what it can do is it can actually cause all the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. It's also been linked to restless leg syndrome and inflammatory problems. So it is something that I think is going on in many of us, and it's just part of that. We're getting by, but our digestive tracts could be a lot healthier. All right, well, our time is up. I hope that this information was helpful for you. Make sure you stay on because you need to do the following things in order to get your certificate. I hope this was helpful. All of the information will be available to you to be able to look at these slides and go through it again. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.